king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 281, Charging forward is equal to suicide. In the battle formation era before the trench warfare era, artillery bombardment was a very cruel process. Because the armies of both sides were standing there in dense formations, it was very suitable for artillery shells to kill. This is why Napoleon's grand artilleryism was so brilliant. Marin, who was watching through a telescope on a high platform in the rear, saw the terrible result immediately after the artillery fired. At the beginning, Marin's artillery was still adjusting, so the first round of bombardment was generally ineffective. But even so, it brought terrible casualties to the Saxon army. Because, the 3-pound iron ball flew into the Saxon army, and although the first round of the shot was very poor, the 20,000 Saxon troops were so densely packed that there were always unlucky people who were hit by the shells. Then, in Marin's telescope, there appeared a terrifying scene where the knights in the front row of the Saxon army were hit by 3-pound iron balls and 4 horses were pierced at once. Because the artillery under Marin's command was flat firing and used powerful granular gunpowder. If used to attack infantry, it might penetrate 15 people. However, the body of a warhorse is very long, and when the cannonball passes through the body of a warhorse, the long body of the warhorse has a greater resistance to the cannonball than a human. Therefore, a 3-pound iron ball that can penetrate 15 people can only penetrate 4 horses. But even so, the Saxon knights were frightened. The iron ball of the 3-pound cannon whistled towards the front of the Saxon formation. One cannonball could penetrate 4 horses. After being penetrated, the horses were stunned for a moment, and then the blood holes spurted out warm blood. Then, the horses wailed and fell to the ground, throwing the knights off and rolling on the ground. Some cannonballs fired at a higher angle, and the shells happened to hit the knights on horseback. Although the knights were wearing a full set of plate armor, it was useless. In front of the fierce 3-pound iron ball, an unlucky knight, with his head and helmet, was directly smashed away by the 3-pound iron ball. Then, a large amount of blood spurted out of his neck without a head, splashing all over the knights around him. That's not all, the cannonballs continued to fly and hit the next knight, smashing his plate armor and killing him on the spot. This horrific scene frightened the Saxon knights who were watching from the side, fearing that they would be the next unlucky ones. They wanted to spur their horses to the side to avoid the range of the artillery fire. However, the strict military discipline and the honor of the knights forced them to stay where they were, praying that the shells would not hit them next time. The knights whose horses were killed and fell to the ground hurriedly ran to the back of the battle formation to find horses under the pretext of changing horses. However, these people also made up their minds, changing horses must be delayed, and it would be best to delay until the end of the artillery battle before returning. Next, the Marin artillery paid more attention to the artillery on the opposite side. Because the artillery commander Gao Qi said that attacking the enemy artillery was the most important task of the artillery. Because the enemy's artillery could also bring great danger to our side. So, after the adjustments, the gunners loaded the shells, and the artilleryman in charge of aiming squatted down to observe the sight behind the artillery, so that it was facing the enemy artillery. Of course, the sight was aimed at the enemy artillery's head. But when the shell flew over, it had already dropped to the chest position. After the observation, another gunner raised the wooden stick with the match tied to it, blew on the match to make it burn more vigorously, and then ignited the fuse on the firing hole. Boom, 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 53-pound cannons roared one after another. Because they had practiced flat shooting a lot, the artillerymen had good shooting accuracy. All of a sudden, more than a dozen Saxon artillerymen who were still adjusting their gun positions were killed by iron balls on the spot. Their deaths were all very tragic. Either their heads were blown off, or their arms and legs were smashed off by iron balls. Anyway, they could no longer use the artillery. After being frightened, the Saxon artillerymen all shrank back in fear. However, under the orders of the officers, they still began to load and fire. The Saxon artillery is different from Marin's artillery. Marin's 3-pounder cannon is a muzzle-loading cannon with better airtightness, but a slightly slower rate of fire. Generally speaking, Marin's artillery can only fire once every 45 seconds. The Saxons use flanger cannons, with multiple sub-guns and a faster rate of fire, firing once every 20 to 30 seconds on average. However, Marin's artillery uses granular gunpowder bonded and processed with fish skin glue made from fish skin, while the Saxon artillery uses ordinary powdered black gunpowder. Therefore, the power of the Saxon artillery is naturally smaller than that of Marin's artillery. However, the barrel of Saxony's artillery is relatively long, exceeding 1 meter. The barrel of Marin's 3-pounder is only 0.65 meters long. According to common sense, the longer the barrel, the greater the range. However, the Saxon artillery has a gap between the breech-loading subgun and the barrel, and the airtightness is not good. In addition, gunpowder is used. Therefore, in the end, the effective range of Saxony's artillery is only 200 meters. Marin's 3-pounder has an effective range of 365 meters and is more powerful. After Marin's artillery fired 3 rounds, Saxony's artillery finally started firing. However, the Saxon artillery had no sights, so it was inconvenient to aim. Therefore, although the Saxon artillery tried their best to aim at Marin's artillery, they were still not very accurate. However, after several rounds of shooting, Marin still lost more than a dozen artillerymen. But during this period, Marin's artillerymen caused dozens of casualties to the opponent's artillery. Because Marin's artillery had sights on the mountain, it was easier to aim at the opponent's artillery. As the bombardment continued, many people on both sides died under the shells, and their deaths were very tragic. However, because of its great power, Marin's artillery had a stronger, penetrating effect and caused greater casualties. When the Saxon shells hit the position of Marin's phalanx, they had insufficient kinetic energy and could only penetrate the first 2 or 3 people at most. They could not penetrate the back. Marin's 3-pound cannon shells could either penetrate a few horses or a dozen people. The Duke of Saxony saw this and thought, this is too much. If the bombardment continues, he will definitely suffer the most casualties in the end. So he ordered a suspension of the bombardment and prepared to send knights to attack Marin's artillery positions and kill all the artillerymen under Marin's command first. So, at the signal from the Duke of Saxony, thousands of knights began to gather and slowly speed up. Seeing that the other party finally lost his patience, Marin was also very happy. He shouted, "Gunners keep firing, musketeers get ready." Then, a few loudmouths passed on Marin's orders to the front using earthen horns. The musketeers clipped the ends of the matchlocks wrapped around their left arms onto the trigger system of their muskets. As for the ammunition, it had already been loaded and was ready to be fired. After getting ready, the musketeers placed their muskets flat on the wooden brackets in front of them to facilitate aiming. However, they cannot fire without orders. When the Saxon knights rushed to a distance of 50 meters, they were able to shoot with greater certainty. So the musketeer commanders shouted, "Fire! Fire!" Snap, 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 gunshots rang out one after another, and in front of the Marin army, bursts of white smoke and a pungent smell of burning sulfur were emitted. After the shooting was finished, the musketeers in the first row quickly retracted their muskets, retreated to the rear and began to reload. The shooters in the second row placed their muskets, which had been prepared long ago, on the brackets in the front row and began to aim. After the first round of shooting, 70 to 80 Saxon knights were knocked off their horses by the 50-gram bullets. Some were seriously injured on the spot, while others were not seriously injured but were knocked off their horses by the huge impact, with stars in their eyes, and some were directly knocked unconscious. Then, the second round of shooting came again. This time, because the distance was closer, the musketeers' accuracy was higher. After one round of shooting, more than 150 Saxon knights fell off their horses. Then came the third round of shooting. In this round, 200 Saxon knights fell. Of course, at this time, the Saxon knights also rushed to the front of Marin's army. However, they would never have thought that on the seemingly flat ground before them, there were 2 hidden trenches full of traps and malicious intent. As a result, the remaining less than 600 Saxon knights, the people in the front row, fell into the pit with their horses. Many horses had wooden stakes directly stuck in their bellies. Many Saxon knights were also injured by the wooden stakes. Moreover, once the knights charged, they could not stop at all. Even if the knights in the back row saw the people in the front row falling into the pit full of wooden stakes, they had no time to rein in their horses and had to fall into the pit with them. Even the luckiest knights only avoided falling into the pits because their horses stepped on their comrades' horses or themselves. However, under the 2 big pits, the knights lost their balance and fell in and out of the pits. In the end, no knight could cross the 2 trenches. Even if they had a majestic horse and crossed the 2 trenches, they still could not escape the tragic fate of being blocked or even stabbed to death by the wooden stakes inserted diagonally into the ground in front of Marin's formation. For a moment, most of the 1,000 Saxon knights and their horses who had charged in the first round lay in or near the 2 trenches, looking extremely miserable. However, this is not the worst. Some of the stronger musketeers in front of Marin's formation swung up the long-handled sledgehammers that had been placed in front of the formation, and began to smash the Saxon knights who had fallen into the second ditch close to Marin's battle formation through the wooden spikes. The dull sound of bang bang was heard frequently. Many Saxon knights were not stabbed to death by wooden stakes, nor were they killed by falling, but were smashed to death by big iron hammers. That was not all. When the musketeers holding hammers saw that there were no survivors in the second ditch, they retreated and asked the first row of musketeers who had retreated to the back and reloaded their ammunition to return to the front and start aiming at the Saxon knights lying near the first ditch. Once again, a large number of unlucky Saxon knights died. In this way, the first batch of 1,000 Saxon knights who charged over were easily defeated by Marin's phalanx, and not many survived. In the end, the ones who survived were the injured knights in the first and second batches who were knocked off their horses by muskets. As for the more than 500 knights who rushed to the front of the formation, most of them were killed on the spot. Even if there were some who survived, they were seriously injured by the hammers and muskets and were not far from death. Chapter 282, Black Knight attacks. After Marin saw the battle situation clearly through a telescope on the high platform at the back, he jumped up happily. Of course, he still felt a little uncomfortable. You know, these 1,000 knights are basically from knight families. Most of those who have official titles are actually wandering knights like Marin before, who could not survive and turned to the wealthy Duke of Saxony. Therefore, Marin was actually sad when he saw them being killed by his own men. Moreover, after this battle, Marin was sure that he would offend many knight families. Because their sons were either dead or disabled in Marin's hands. However, Marin did not regret it at all. Who told these guys to get involved with his mortal enemy, the Duke of Saxony? If you follow the wrong master, you must be prepared to die. In the Saxon army on the other side, the Duke of Saxony, who was also standing on a makeshift wooden tower, was furious. Asshole. Marin, that asshole, actually slaughtered my knights. Although he was far away, the Duke of Saxony could still vaguely see the knights who fell in front of the battle being hit by hammers or shot at by muskets at close range by Marin's men. On the battlefield, there were screams of those once noble knights. In the blink of an eye, all 1,000 of Saxony's elite heavy cavalrymen were killed. Although there were still many wounded people surviving in the middle of the battlefield, with the medical conditions of that era, most of the knights lying in the middle would still be dead. However, in order to avoid his men feeling sad about the death of the rabbit, the Duke of Saxony still sent a small number of his auxiliary light cavalry to the middle of the battlefield to rescue people. Perhaps, out of courtesy, Marin did not order the Saxon auxiliary light cavalry who came to rescue to shoot. In fact, Marin was not out of courtesy, he just wanted to use the wailing of the wounded to hit the morale of the Saxons. The Duke of Saxony was furious. He had originally thought that the battle would be easy, but he lost thousands of knights at the beginning, which was already a serious blow to him. Because, the knights and trainee knights under his command only added up to 3,000 people. Now, in one round of charge, he lost nearly one-third of them. Such a loss was unbearable even for the rich Duchy of Saxony. After all, these knights were not those lowly conscripts who would not feel bad if they died. You know, these heavy cavalrymen wearing plate armor all come from various knight families in Germany. Even the lowest-ranking heavy cavalrymen come from the families of those official knights, usually the non-eldest sons of those knight families. Now, with thousands of casualties, the Duke of Saxony doesn't know how to explain to these families. After all, the Duchy of Saxony is still a vassal state under the feudal system. Even the Duke of Saxony is just a great noble at the top of the feudal system, and he also needs the support of the lower nobles. Because, in this era, local official positions are basically controlled by these lower-level knight families and knight families. Without their support, the Duke of Saxony's rule will be unstable. Sure enough, the knights who were knocked off their horses by muskets were brought back with shrill cries, which made their colleagues feel sympathetic. Then, they looked at Marin's battle formation with fear. What Marin did this time was really cruel and ruthless. Usually, after those knights were knocked off their horses, they were usually tied up by their opponents and asked for ransom. However, Marin was not short of money, and he was also worried that after these knights were redeemed, they would continue to serve the Duke of Saxony and continue to embarrass him. Moreover, Marin also wanted to play a big and ruthless game so that those nobles would not dare to provoke him easily. Therefore, the knights who charged in the first wave were in bad luck. After landing, many knights were still waiting for the other side to capture them. The children were thinking about whether they should be reserved or surrendered directly. Unexpectedly, what they were greeted with was a bloody hammer and evil bullets, which did not give them a chance to think. After the anger subsided, the Duke of Saxony knew that a frontal breakthrough was not very realistic. From the injured knight who was rescued, he learned that there were 2 pits filled with vicious wooden stakes in front of the Marin battle formation, making it difficult for the heavy cavalry to break through. Not only that, even if the heavy cavalry crossed the 2 pits, there was still a row of wooden stakes facing forward in front, which was also very deadly. In such a formation, it was very risky to break through with. What's more, the opponent also had many musketeers with amazing lethality. Therefore, the Duke of Saxony calmed down and thought about it, and decided to look for opportunities from the flank. Mavis, take 500 cavalrymen to scout the enemy's flank and see if there are any traps on their flank. It happened that the Duke of Saxony saw Mavis returning from changing horses, so he asked him to take 500 people to observe Marin's war from the side and look for the opponent's weaknesses. The frontal attack was difficult, so the Duke of Saxony turned his attention to other directions. So, Mavis led 500 cavalrymen to the left side of Marin's battle formation. Coincidentally, Marin deployed all the musketeers to the front, and there were no musketeers on the sides. Therefore, when Mavis led his men to observe the flank of Marin's battle formation, they were not shot by muskets. Therefore, they could stay and observe leisurely. As an experienced knight, Mavis was also very sensible. He just learned what happened before and knew what the Duke meant, so he found a few knights and gave the order, "You guys, charge forward, stop when you get close to the enemy, and see if there are any traps." The unlucky ones who were named were about to cry, "Sir, if there is a trap, we will be dead." They all knew that the trap set by Marin was very vicious. The two trenches were full of wooden stakes pointing upwards, which could kill horses if not people. Moreover, with the ruthlessness of Marin's men against the first batch of charging knights, even if they were not killed by the stakes, they would be beaten to death by the enemy soldiers. Well, that makes sense. "You guys, go pick up some stones, rush to the front and back of the formation, and throw them to see if there are any traps. I think the land on their flank doesn't seem normal." After a while, the knights really picked up a few small stones, rode forward, and threw them when they were close to the flank of Marin's battle formation, hitting the branches and dead grass that covered the trap. Then, the trench was discovered. Sure enough, there are traps. This Marin is really cruel. He even dug so many traps on the flanks. Yeah, there are also wooden stakes. Mavis turned to the right and tried with the stone, but there was still a trap. Marin saw this and thought, "This guy is looking for a trap, and he is so leisurely. He can't let him be so arrogant." So he called Steindorf, the leader of the Black Knights, "It's your turn now. Take your Blackshirt Knights and destroy these Saxon knights." "Yes, sir." Steindorf had been waiting impatiently at the rear of the army. Moreover, he was also eager to make a contribution. After receiving Marin's order, they came out from behind the formation, each holding a carbine, and ran towards the 500 knights led by Mavis with great momentum. Horse-mounted musketeers. Mavis was stunned at first, then he laughed, "Brothers, the enemy is delivering food. Follow me and kill all the hundreds of enemy cavalrymen in black clothes on the opposite side. They are holding musketeers, and you will be slaughtered if you get close to us." Mavis obviously mistook the mounted musketeers for infantry musketeers. So, the 500 knights under Mavis lined up, raised their lances, and prepared to attack Steindorf's Black Knights and then slaughter them at close range. However, what surprised Mavis and the others was that the Blackshirt Knights led by Steindorf did not run directly towards them. At a distance of 100 meters, the Blackshirt Knights turned around and ran to the front of the formation, perpendicular to the direction of Mavis and the others. However, their route was a little strange. It looked like they were heading south, but in fact they were heading southwest, getting closer and closer to Mavis' 500 Saxon knights. When they were within 50 meters of each other, the Black Knights opened fire. Pa pa pa, after a burst of gunfire, more than 30 Saxon knights fell off their horses. That is to say, the horse archery level of these Blackshirt Knights is still very average. After all, horse archery is too difficult to practice. Moreover, Mavis's men were arranged in a square formation, which was not very wide. At the same time, the musketeers fired to the right, which was awkward and inconvenient to aim. Otherwise, there would definitely be more than 30 people falling in this round, but more. When Mavis and his men began to speed up and chase the Blackshirt Knight, Steindorf and his men turned around and began to run southeast, keeping a distance from Mavis and his men. Another round of shooting. Then, more than 20 Saxon knights fell down. Mavis wanted to chase again, but he found that he was getting closer and closer to Marin's battle formation. If he didn't stop, he might fall into the pit directly. So he had to let his men slow down. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the Blackshirt Knights turned around and started firing, and they stopped and turned around to fire. Pa 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 dash, this time the Blackshirt Knights had a much higher hit rate, and 60 to 70 people were knocked off their horses. Mavis didn't dare to stay. He realized that his knights couldn't catch up with the black-clad light cavalry. The other side didn't care about honor at all and was very shameless. So he simply led his men to flee to the main camp. But during the retreat, they were chased by 800 Blackshirt Knights, who fired 2 rounds of black guns from behind. As a result, hundreds of Saxon knights fell off their horses. Unfortunately, the black-shirt knights only brought 5 carbines and had no ammunition. Because it was inconvenient to reload on horseback and they were vulnerable to attack by the enemy, they returned to the rear of the main camp to reload. Chapter 283 Desperate, what kind of troops are these? Why are they fighting in such a shameless way? The Duke of Saxony, who was standing on the high platform at the back watching the battle, asked his subordinates. Of course, his subordinates didn't know, because it was the first time for the black-shirt knights to participate in the battle. After reloading at the rear of the battle formation, Steindorf and his men swaggered back to the front of the battle formation, ran to the vicinity of the Saxon battle formation, stopped their horses, and shot at the plate-armored knights from 50 meters away. As a result, a large number of Saxon knights were shot down. Seeing this, the Duke of Saxony was furious and sent 1,000 knights to chase. Unfortunately, when Steindorf and others saw the Saxon knights start to speed up, they turned their horses and ran away. Because they were light cavalry, they naturally ran faster than the Saxon knights. Therefore, the Saxon knights did not catch up. When they approached Marin's battle formation, they were shot down by the musketeers. When the Saxon knights turned around, the black-shirt knights approached them again and fired at them from behind. Asshole! Asshole! Does Marin, this asshole, have any shame? He actually let someone shoot a knight in the back. The Duke of Saxony was angry again. The black-shirt knights had harassed him several times and killed or injured 300 or 400 Saxon knights, which made the Duke of Saxony very angry. Moreover, he had no way to crack it. In fact, the Duke of Saxony also has light cavalry that can catch up with the black-shirt knights. However, the number of light cavalry is small, only 500 people. Their usual tasks are just to scout and pass on messages. Therefore, the scale is not very large. This was also the Duke of Saxony's own fault. Because of his wealth, he disdained to form a light cavalry with poor head-on ability. If it were the Duke of Milan, his cavalry would basically be light cavalry, and he would be much better at chasing the black-shirt knights. The Duke of Saxony had no choice but to send 500 light cavalry to hunt down the Black Knights. However, such a small number of people was not enough to fight against the Black Knights. First, there are 800 Black Knights. Moreover, each of them has 5 carbines. Moreover, these people can not only shoot, but also use sabers in close combat. After the two sides met, Steindorf did not fight directly, but fled to the side with his men. Then, he fired while setting off firecrackers. 500 Saxon cavalrymen chased the black-shirt knights closely. However, they were all light cavalry without armor, and had no protection against bullets. When the black-shirt knights ran back to the vicinity of the main camp, the other side had been shot 3 times, with more than 100 people killed or injured. That's not all. When the Saxons chased to the vicinity of Marin's battle formation, the black-shirt knights stepped aside and let the musketeers in their own formation use their long-barreled muskets to attack the Saxon light cavalry again. In desperation, the Saxon light cavalry had to flee. As a result, the morale of the remaining 300-odd Saxon light cavalry dropped to the freezing point. After Steindorf returned to his camp and loaded all 50 carbines with ammunition, he turned around and pursued the Saxon light cavalry. A fierce battle broke out between the two sides. The morale of the Saxon light cavalry was low, and they were outnumbered. When the black-shirt knights ran out of bullets, they drew their sabers and began to chase and hack at the Saxon light cavalry. At this time, there were only 200 Saxon light cavalry left. The black-shirt knights only injured 3 people during the fight, and they were all rescued by their comrades. In desperation, the Duke of Saxony had to give up the plan of using light cavalry to chase the black-shirt knights. However, the black-shirt knights did not intend to let the Saxons go, and continued to approach the Saxon battle formation from the side, harassing and shooting the Saxon knights who stayed in the formation. In each wave of their attack, many Saxon plate-armored knights were knocked off their horses. Your Excellency Duke, if this continues, our knights will become fewer and fewer. Adjutant Baron Donitz began to get anxious. Then what do you say we should do? We can't catch up with those cunning black rats, said the Duke of Saxony angrily. How about we have the infantry start the charge? Infantry charge? Even the knights can't charge through, how can the infantry do it? Your Excellency Duke, knights are valuable, but infantrymen's lives are cheap. Donitz whispered, you mean? I have summarized that the battle formation on the opposite side now has 2 trenches filled with spikes and a row of wooden spikes for protection, which is indeed not conducive to cavalry charges. However, infantry can charge, because infantry will not fall into the pit like war horses that cannot stop. That's true. Although infantry attacks are slower, they won't fall into the trenches like cavalry. But how do we get through the trenches? Let's have the infantry bring more planks or carry more soil. In short, we need to find a way to fill these trenches, even if it's just filling a section. Good idea. The Duke of Saxony's eyes lit up. But this will kill many people. The musketeers on the opposite side are very lethal. The Duke of Saxony hesitated again. Your Excellency the Duke, we can let the regular army escort the conscripts to carry the planks and soil in front. Even if some of the conscripts die, so what? As long as we can fill the trenches, we can launch a general attack. As long as we can break into the enemy's battle formation, I think your knights will not let you down. Well, that makes sense. If my knights have another chance to engage in close combat, they will be able to completely defeat them. After making up his mind, the Duke of Saxony began to mercilessly order the 5,000 regular infantrymen and some of the temporarily recruited militiamen to carry soil and planks and walk in the front. In order to break through Marin's defense line, the Duke of Saxony also tried his best. He knew that after issuing this order, his reputation in the country would be much worse. Because forcing conscripts to fill the ditch was no different from sending them to their deaths. However, the Duke of Saxony was extremely angry with Marin at this time, because almost half of his 3,000 best plate knights, including trainee knights, were injured. This was also a serious injury to the Duke of Saxony. But if he turned back and fled now, not only would the rear half of his troops be wiped out by Marin's army when they crossed the river, he himself would never be able to hold his head up in the aristocratic circle again. Therefore, for the sake of victory and dignity, the Duke of Saxony decided to fight to the death and sacrifice the conscripted militiamen to fill the abominable trenches that hindered the Saxon army's offensive. Then, he would let the highly skilled plate knights rush into the enemy camp and kill the enemy wantonly to wash away the previous shame. Moreover, in order to cut down the wooden stakes in front of the formation, the Duke of Saxony ordered 500 knights to dismount, hold two-handed swords, and follow the infantry on foot. Once the infantry filled the two trenches, they were responsible for cutting down the wooden stakes that were in the way with two-handed swords. Then, they took the opportunity to rush into the enemy formation and cut and kill, and guard the gap, waiting for their own knights to rush in. Marin looked through the telescope and saw that the Saxons had moved their infantry in front of the knights. He was stunned for a moment. When he saw some Saxon infantry carrying many backpacks, he quickly realized that the other side was determined to fill the trench with human lives. Although they were opponents, Marin still praised the Duke of Saxony in his heart. Because this was the best choice for the Duke of Saxony. After all, trenches and wooden stakes were a magic weapon against cavalry. Because war horses were just beasts after all, and they didn't know how to avoid trenches and stakes. Moreover, war horses couldn't stop when they ran. But the infantry was different. They walked slowly, but they could easily avoid falling into the trenches. Moreover, many of them carried bags filled with soil, which they threw into the trenches to fill a path, making it easier for the Saxon army to get closer to Marin's battle formation. Moreover, the bodies of many Saxon knights and their horses that failed in the first batch of charges were in the trenches, making it easy for the infantry to fill the trenches. If the trenches were successfully filled and the wooden stakes in front of the formation were cut down, the two sides would indeed be able to engage in a fair head-on confrontation. However, although the Duke of Saxony had a good idea, he overlooked the lethality of muskets. You know, Marin had 2,500 musketeers in front of the battle line. 2,500 musketeers took turns shooting continuously, and the infantry ran slowly. By the time they ran to the front of the battle line, God knew how many were left. Therefore, although the Duke of Saxony's arrangement was wise, it ignored the striking power of the musketeers. What's more, during the advance, the Saxon infantry could only passively be shot at by Marin's musketeers as targets because they had no musketeers, and could not fight back. Moreover, at the edge of the battlefield, 800 blackshirt knights, also armed with muskets, were still waiting eagerly. Marin called the herald and ordered the musketeers to load their ammunition and prepare to shoot. At the same time, he also gave Steindorf an order to go to the enemy infantry's flank and shoot at the dismounted knights behind the infantry that he saw through the telescope. Although Marin didn't guess that those dismounted knights were here to chop wooden stakes, he knew that those knights on foot must have important combat missions. If they were allowed to charge into the battle formation, it would indeed cause considerable casualties. At least, the musketeers would be easily chopped. After receiving the order, Steindorf led the blackshirt knights to roam on both sides of the advancing Saxon infantry, specifically killing the dismounted knights hiding behind the infantry. Although these knights on foot were blocked by infantry in front, the musketeers could not hit them. However, the blackshirt knights coming from the flank could easily find them from the side and kill them with carbines.